Welcome to the Divine Identity Podcast. In this episode, we are examining the Jewish concept of Shaliach, or agency. Jesus was truly sent by God, but does Jewish agency actually explain who Jesus is, how he came into being, and what God accomplished through him? Today, we're diving straight into this explainer, and our central thesis is absolutely crucial. Shaliach is a legitimate category for sending, representation, and mission, but it's ultimately way too narrow to explain Jesus' true identity, his emergence, his divine life, God's presence in him, his resurrection, or the larger biblical movement from death to life.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the meaning of Shaliach. Second, the limits of agency. Third, divine presence and life. Fourth, the Word becoming flesh. Fifth, moving beyond the agency framework entirely. And finally, number 6, the larger biblical story.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the meaning of Shaliach.
Now, the core legal principle at play here is actually really fascinating. The Hebrew word shaliach comes from the root shalach, which simply means to send. Over time, in later Jewish law, it evolved into this legal concept of an authorized representative. You know, there's this well-known rabbinic formula that states, a person's agent is like himself. But, and this is absolutely vital, we have to understand what like himself actually means here. It strictly concerns delegated action and commission. It means that within a specific authorized matter, say a legal contract or divorce, the agent's actions are legally attributed to the sender. It does not mean they somehow share the same being, life, or identity. It's purely about delegated authority.
Which brings us right to section 2, the limits of agency. So what happens when we apply this strict legal framework to the biblical text? Well, the source material makes a really crucial historical distinction here. Jesus absolutely was sent by the Father, right? He acted in total obedience, so calling him an agent is definitely a valid description of his mission. But we've got to be careful. You see, biblical sending significantly predates the highly developed later rabbinic formulations of Shaliach that we find in the Mishnah and Talmud around 200 CE. We literally cannot take a later, fully mature legal doctrine and just assume it's the hidden theological blueprint for every single New Testament statements about Jesus being sent. And think about it, just being sent isn't really enough to explain Jesus. Because God sent Moses to Pharaoh. He sent Isaiah to Israel. John the Baptist was sent. Heck, even Jesus' own apostles and disciples were sent. Because prophets, apostles, and disciples were all commissioned, just being sent cannot, by itself, explain what makes Jesus uniquely the Son of God. Sure, you could call him the greatest Shaliach, but that just increases his authority, right? It doesn't actually explain his unique nature. This brings us to a really sharp contrast between mission and identity. You see, Shaliach perfectly explains Jesus' earthly mission, his delegated authority, and his obedience. It completely explains what he is authorized to do. But here's the catch. It entirely fails to explain his actual identity. It doesn't tell us how he came into being. It doesn't explain his shared being. And it doesn't explain how God is actually present in him. In short, it explains the what of his job, but definitely not the who of his existence. Let's move on to section 3, divine presence and life. We really need to cross-examine this agency concept against some of the boldest New Testament claims about God's actual presence. Paul writes, God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. And later he says, the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. Jesus himself literally says the Father dwells in him. Guys, this goes way beyond just representative authority. This isn't just an agent carrying a letter for a king. No, this is God himself acting by his own spirit through his form, truly present and active right there in the Messiah. Shaliach can explain representation for sure, but it absolutely cannot explain actual divine presence. And look at this verse. A legal agent just receives instructions, jurisdiction, or maybe authority. But here, John 5:26 tells us, the Father grants the Son to have life in himself. The Father possesses life underivatively, right? But the Son possesses that life because it was literally given to him. An earthly agent doesn't receive the actual life force of their boss. That's just not how it works. This completely breaks the boundaries of the Shaliach framework. Okay, section 4, the Word becoming flesh. Here's where we hit what is probably the most compelling structural flaw of the whole agency model, the actual origins of the Son. The structural problem is super clear. Agency, by its very definition, assumes you already have a principal and an already existing agent. I mean, you can't hire an agent who hasn't even been born yet, right? But the biblical account of Jesus begins before there is a human Jesus available to actually receive a commission. Shaliach only covers his earthly mission. it starts way too late to explain how he actually came into being. To understand that emergence, the article points us to the pattern we see in Genesis 2:7 and John 1:14. It's a concept the author calls constituent emergence. Think of it like this. Mary supplies the physical constituent, the human body. But God acts by his own spirit and power, supplying the spiritual constituent, that is, his own personal living structure, his form, which John designates as the Word. And from this incredible union of the physical and the spiritual emerges one real, fully human Son straight into historical existence. Which brings us right to John 1:14, the Word became flesh. The source clarifies something super important here. God himself remains the acting subject. God's form and his inner spirit are personal realities that belong intrinsically to the one divine person. They aren't separate divine persons hanging out beside him. Because God himself is intimately, personally involved in this historical coming into being, it totally shatters the whole mold of having a separate sender and a pre-existing separate agent. Moving on to Section 5, Beyond the Agency Framework. We've already seen that Shaliach begins too late, but what about after the cross? Let's rapid fire through Paul's post-resurrection language. Believers are baptized into Christ, united with him, we have Christ in you, we are raised with Christ, and we're even told Christ who is your life. Just think about this for your own life for a second. You don't get baptized into a legal representative. You aren't united with a messenger. This language overwhelmingly proves that believers participate in Christ's actual life today. So if Shaliach begins too late to explain Jesus' birth, it definitely ends way too early to explain our participation in his resurrection. And that leads us to Section 6, the larger biblical story. Let's zoom out and look at the overarching narrative of humanity from the book of Genesis onward. This is the ultimate narrative hinge. What has God done about death? As the source points out, the Bible doesn't actually begin with a representation problem. Genesis begins with life and death. And humanity's fundamental problem after the fall is spiritual death. We are dead in our transgressions. A better messenger or a higher-ranking legal agent simply cannot solve death. The law couldn't give life, and the prophets only announced it. So the central question isn't just who speaks for God, but what has God actually done about death? To answer that, the author introduces a much wider framework called aspectable monotheism. Now, unlike Shaliach, this framework is actually capable of holding together the entire story. It preserves the one God as the personal divine I, his form as his living spiritual structure, and his inner spirit as his inward divine life. And it does all of this without dividing God into separate persons. This incredibly robust framework allows for sending, emergence, presence, and resurrection to all exist harmoniously together. And that is something agency alone simply cannot do. When you summarize the biblical categories into sending, emergence, presence, and life and resurrection, Shaliach really only explains the very first one. The source material is super clear about this. Jewish agency is not false. Not at all. It's just a subcategory. It's entirely insufficient as a complete Christology, because it leaves how Jesus came to be, God's presence in him, and the new covenant salvation completely unexplained. To pull this all together, Shaliach explains sending, representation, and mission. But the larger biblical story? That explains constitution, divine presence, life, resurrection, and our actual participation in that life. Taking a strict legal category of delegation and trying to stretch it into a framework for the entire biblical story is just asking it to carry weight it was never designed to hold. Ultimately, it comes down to this central thesis. Shaliach begins too late to explain Jesus' unique emergence, and it ends too early to explain the resurrection life that becomes absolutely central to new covenant salvation. It's an important piece of the puzzle, for sure, but it is not the whole picture. If Jesus is just a messenger, what does that mean for the life he promised to share with us? To answer that, and for a fuller exploration of this teaching, read theologian and teacher 𝗍𝗲𝗄𝗏's article, Shaliach, Why Jewish Agency Cannot Explain the Identity of Jesus, available at christrooted.org.